In the Middle Ages, a forest after dark wasn't what you think. No light, no paths, no safety. Step inside and you'd face dangers most people today can't even imagine. The question is, what would come for you first? On top of the lurking threats, the forests themselves were dangerous in a different way. Medieval royal forests operated under their own brutal legal system, completely separate from normal kingdom laws. These weren't just hunting preserves. They were territories where breaking the wrong branch could literally cost you your life. Killing a deer in a royal forest was a hanging offense, no questions asked. Even cutting firewood or gathering berries could result in severe punishment, including imprisonment, heavy fines, or execution. Royal forest laws were like having a homeowners association run by executioners who really took their job seriously. Forest wardens and rangers had almost unlimited authority within these boundaries. They could arrest, fine, or even kill anyone they suspected of poaching or trespassing. These officials answered directly to the crown and showed no mercy to violators, regardless of their circumstances. Forest wardens were basically medieval parking enforcement officers, except instead of writing tickets, they handed out death sentences. They patrolled their territories regularly and knew every trail, clearing, and hiding spot where lawbreakers might attempt their crimes. Forest courts were real institutions that operated with harsh efficiency. Peasants feared being caught by forest officials more than they feared wild animals. The legal proceedings were swift and the punishments were severe. There was no appeal process or mercy for first-time offenders. Getting dragged before a forest court was like being tried by a jury of hanging judges who had already made up their minds before you walked in. The assumption was guilt, not innocence, and the burden of proof fell entirely on the accused to demonstrate their legitimacy. Local people knew exactly where these forbidden zones began and ended, but outsiders had absolutely no way of identifying royal forest boundaries. There were no signs, markers, or warnings to alert travelers that they were entering restricted territory. You could accidentally wander into a royal forest while seeking shelter or trying to find your way, only to discover that your innocent mistake had become a capital crime. Many travelers learned about forest laws only when it was far too late to matter. But legal dangers were just one of many human threats lurking in medieval woodlands. Medieval forests served as perfect sanctuaries for society's most dangerous outcasts: bandits, army deserters, runaway serfs, and escaped criminals who had absolutely nothing left to lose. These desperate people formed organized gangs that terrorized anyone foolish enough to enter their territory. Robbery was incredibly common on forest roads, especially near major trade routes and pilgrim paths where wealthy travelers were likely to pass. Forest bandits had better market research than modern businesses. They knew exactly when and where the money would be walking by. Some bandit groups stationed lookouts in tall trees to spot approaching victims from miles away. These scouts used horn calls, smoke signals, or bird whistles to alert their companions about incoming opportunities for theft and violence. Banditry scouts were like medieval security cameras, except instead of recording crimes, they were planning them. The elevated positions gave them perfect views of forest paths while keeping them hidden from travelers below. Clever bandit groups used psychological warfare to increase their success rates. They created fake road signs pointing towards supposed towns or shortcuts that actually led to carefully prepared ambush sites. Other gangs dug covered pits or stretched ropes across paths to trip horses and riders. Violence wasn't just a possibility during bandit encounters, it was practically guaranteed. These criminals didn't simply steal your belongings and send you on your way. Torture, assault, and murder were standard practices whether you resisted or cooperated fully with their demands. Meeting forest bandits was like encountering customer service representatives who had completely given up on customer satisfaction and decided that murdering clients was more efficient. They had no interest in repeat business because they never intended to let customers leave alive. Local lords and their soldiers often couldn't control these bandit populations effectively. Dense forests provided too many hiding spots and escape routes for conventional military tactics to work. Entire regions became known as lawless zones where even armed patrols refused to venture. Some forest areas remained under bandit control for years or even decades, creating permanent no-go zones that travelers learned to avoid completely. Maps didn't mark these dangerous territories, so newcomers discovered them only through deadly experience. Yet even surviving bandit encounters didn't guarantee safety in a medieval forest. Fire represented the ultimate survival paradox in medieval forests. You absolutely needed it to live through the night, but creating and maintaining it could easily get you killed. Starting a fire without modern tools required perfect conditions that simply didn't exist in most forest environments. Wet wood was completely useless for fire starting, and medieval forests were naturally humid places where moisture soaked into everything. Only the driest bark, moss, or punk wood had any chance of catching a spark, and finding such materials in darkness was nearly impossible. Trying to start a fire with damp forest materials was like attempting to light a swimming pool with a birthday candle. Even experienced woodsmen struggled to create flames when working with wet fuel and primitive fire-starting methods. The flint and steel method was your best option, but it still required bone-dry tinder and perfect technique. One mistake meant starting the entire process over again, which could take hours you didn't have while predators circled in the darkness. Making fire with flint and steel was like trying to light a match during a windstorm while wearing thick gloves and being chased by wolves. The sparks were tiny and brief, requiring immediate transfer to perfectly prepared tinder bundles. Fire smoke created serious tactical problems for forest travelers. The smell could travel for miles, alerting bandits to your exact location and making you an easy target for robbery or worse. Wild animals also investigated smoke sources, potentially bringing dangerous predators directly to your campsite. Summer forest fires were a constant threat that could turn your survival fire into a deadly inferno. Medieval Europe experienced regular drought periods when forests became extremely flammable, and one careless spark could ignite thousands of acres of woodland. Starting an accidental forest fire was like setting off a slow-motion bomb that chased you through the trees at walking speed. You couldn't outrun a major blaze, and medieval people had no firefighting equipment or techniques to stop the spread. If your fire died during the night, your survival chances dropped dramatically within hours. Cold temperatures, predator attacks, and psychological terror all increased rapidly once darkness and cold set in without the protection of flames. Maintaining fire required constant attention and fuel gathering, which meant leaving your safe circle repeatedly to search for suitable wood. Each fuel-gathering expedition risked getting lost, attacked, or injured in the darkness surrounding your small island of light and warmth. Fire management was just one of many skills required for forest survival, and the challenges kept multiplying. Medieval forests weren't peaceful nature retreats. They were active military zones where armies hid between battles and launched surprise attacks on unsuspecting enemies. Walking through these areas meant potentially stumbling into ongoing warfare or deadly traps left behind by previous conflicts. Armies regularly used dense forest cover to conceal troop movements and stage ambushes against rival forces. Forest warfare was like playing the world's deadliest game of hide and seek, where losing meant getting stabbed by people you never saw coming. Military engineers constructed elaborate trap systems designed to kill or maim enemy soldiers moving through forest paths. Covered pits filled with sharpened stakes, concealed snares, and camouflage barriers created invisible minefields that remained dangerous long after armies moved on. Walking through a former battlefield was like navigating a medieval obstacle course designed by people who really wanted you to die horribly. These traps didn't distinguish between enemy soldiers and innocent travelers. They killed anyone unlucky enough to trigger them. Old battlefields littered forest floors with human bones, broken weapons, and rotting equipment that attracted scavengers and predators. The smell of death lingered for months or years, creating an atmosphere of dread that warned smart travelers to find alternate routes. Rebel groups and guerrilla fighters established permanent bases in remote forest locations where government forces couldn't easily reach them. These camps housed armed men who viewed all strangers as potential threats or valuable hostages depending on their apparent wealth and connections. Forest rebel camps were like medieval terrorist cells, except they had better camouflage and more creative torture methods. These groups survived by raiding nearby settlements and eliminating anyone who might report their locations to authorities. Strangers asking questions in forest areas might be military scouts gathering intelligence for future attacks. Seemingly innocent travelers could actually be spies mapping terrain, counting local defenders, or identifying valuable targets for upcoming raids. Even casual conversations with other forest travelers risked revealing information that could be used against you or your community. Medieval people understood that loose talk in dangerous areas often led to devastating consequences for entire villages and regions. War-related dangers were everywhere in medieval forests, but they weren't the only threats facing hungry and thirsty travelers. Finding safe food and clean water in medieval forests required expert knowledge that most people simply didn't possess, and attempting to forage in darkness was essentially suicide by plant. The margin for error was zero when poisonous and edible species looked nearly identical. Edible plants were genuinely rare in dense forest environments, and identifying them safely required good lighting conditions that weren't available at night. Foraging in the dark was like shopping for groceries in a store where half the products were labeled death and the other half just said maybe death. Many forest plants that appeared safe actually required special preparation to remove natural toxins. Some needed cooking, others required soaking or grinding, and a few had to be processed in very specific ways to avoid poisoning. None of these safety steps were possible when you couldn't see what you were doing. Hunting or trapping without proper weapons and daylight was essentially impossible for anyone except true wilderness experts. Medieval people used sophisticated bows, spears, and snare systems that took years to master and required materials you wouldn't have during an emergency forest escape. Trying to hunt forest animals with your bare hands was like attempting to perform surgery with a soup spoon. Technically possible, but almost guaranteed to end badly. Small game animals had excellent night vision, acute hearing, and intimate knowledge of local terrain that gave them overwhelming advantages over desperate humans. Starvation became a serious threat surprisingly quickly when you couldn't locate safe food sources. While the human body could theoretically survive 3 weeks without eating, hunger affected your decision-making abilities and physical coordination within just 12 hours. Risk assessment became nearly impossible when you were desperately hungry. A starving brain was like a smartphone at 2% battery. It might still work, but definitely not when you needed it most. Hungry people made terrible choices about which plants to eat and which risks to take. Drinking untreated water from forest streams was like playing Russian roulette with bacteria, parasites, and other microscopic threats that could cause violent illness within hours. Medieval people knew to boil water before drinking, but that required fire and containers that might not be available. Forest streams looked clean and refreshing, but drinking from them was like inviting every microscopic troublemaker in the forest to throw a party in your digestive system. The resulting diarrhea and vomiting would dehydrate you quickly, creating a downward spiral of weakness and poor judgment. Dehydration progressed much faster than starvation, especially in stressful survival situations where fear and exertion increased water loss through rapid breathing and nervous sweating. You could potentially survive weeks without food, but only 3 to 4 days without water. Yet hunger and thirst were just physical challenges compared to the supernatural terrors that medieval people believed inhabited deep forests. Medieval forests were considered sacred spaces connected to ancient pagan religions that existed long before Christianity spread across Europe. These woodlands supposedly hosted dark magical practices that could damn your soul or cost you your life if you witnessed them accidentally. Pagan fertility ceremonies and seasonal sacrifice rituals were believed to take place in special forest groves during certain times of year. Forest pagan rituals were like medieval rave parties, except instead of dancing to music, people were allegedly dancing with demons and sacrificing goats. Local populations whispered about witches gathering in remote clearings for Sabbath meetings where they practiced spellcasting, summoned evil spirits, and plotted against Christian communities. Whether these stories were true or not, medieval people absolutely believed them and feared stumbling into such gatherings. Accused witches supposedly used forests like conference centers for supernatural crime conventions, complete with demon networking events and evil spell workshops. The church taught that witnessing these activities could corrupt your soul or mark you as a witch collaborator deserving of execution. Strange symbols and mysterious carvings appeared on forest trees, frightening travelers who couldn't understand their meanings or purposes. These markings might have been simple trail markers, territorial boundaries, or innocent artistic expressions, but medieval people interpreted them as evidence of witchcraft. Forest tree carvings were like medieval graffiti, except instead of saying "John loves Mary," They allegedly said, "Satan lives here and demons welcome." Even innocent symbols took on sinister meanings when discovered in isolated woodland areas associated with supernatural activity. Witch trial records frequently mentioned accusations of nighttime forest meetings with devils and demons. Suspects were tortured until they confessed to participating in these woodland gatherings, whether they had actually done so or not. The fear of supernatural forest encounters was so strong that many medieval people preferred risking death from natural causes rather than venturing into areas where they might encounter witchcraft or pagan ceremonies. Better to die from wolves than to lose your eternal soul to forest demons. Church authorities taught that forests contained spiritual dangers far worse than any physical threats from animals or bandits. Salvation was more important than survival, and entering cursed woodlands could jeopardize both your earthly life and your afterlife prospects. Even if you survive supernatural encounters, returning to civilization with stories about forest witchcraft could result in your own execution as a suspected witch or demon collaborator. Sometimes the safest option was to keep dangerous knowledge to yourself forever. But supernatural fears were nothing compared to the very real terror of being completely lost in hostile wilderness. Medieval people had no compasses, detailed maps, or navigation instruments to help them find their way through vast forest territories that covered much of Europe. Once you lost the main trail, finding your way back to civilization became nearly impossible without expert woodcraft skills. European forests were absolutely massive because most of the continent remained undeveloped wilderness. Medieval Europe was like a giant green maze where every path looked identical and there was no exit map posted anywhere. Huge areas hadn't been cleared for farming or connected by roads, creating endless stretches of confusing woodland. Navigation relied entirely on natural signs like sun position, star patterns, and landscape features that weren't visible under thick forest canopy. The techniques that worked in open country became useless when trees blocked your view of the sky and surrounding terrain. Trying to navigate dense forest without instruments was like attempting to drive through fog while wearing a blindfold and using a broken GPS. Even experienced travelers could become disoriented quickly when familiar landmarks disappeared behind walls of trees and undergrowth. Most people couldn't climb trees effectively to get better views of their surroundings, and even those who managed to reach higher branches usually saw nothing but more endless forest stretching in every direction. Tree climbing also risked serious falls that could leave you injured and even more helpless. Some local people tied strings to trees or carved directional marks to help them find their way back along familiar routes. These makeshift navigation aids often faded, rotted away, or were removed by other travelers who didn't want to be followed. Forest trail markers were like medieval breadcrumbs, except birds didn't eat them. Time, weather, and paranoid people did. What worked as guidance 1 month might be completely gone the next time you needed it. Getting lost meant wandering in circles while your energy, food, and water supplies steadily diminished. Medieval people understood that losing your way in deep forest was essentially a death sentence unless you possessed exceptional survival skills or incredible luck. Distance estimation became impossible without visual reference points or familiar landmarks. What felt like miles of progress might actually be a few hundred yards of circular wandering that brought you right back to where you started. Walking lost through medieval forest was like being trapped in a natural version of a hall of mirrors, except instead of seeing multiple reflections, you just saw the same trees over and over again. The psychological effects of being completely lost were almost as dangerous as the physical threats. Panic set in quickly when people realized they had no idea where they were or which direction might lead to safety. Desperate individuals made poor decisions, took unnecessary risks, and often made their situations much worse through frantic attempts to find civilization. Yet even if you somehow avoided getting lost, you still faced the challenge of sleeping safely in an environment designed to kill you. Medieval forest floors provided the worst possible sleeping conditions imaginable: cold, damp, uneven surfaces, crawling with insects and parasites that would torment you throughout the night. Rest was essential for survival, but actually, achieving sleep was nearly impossible under these circumstances. You had no tent, sleeping bag, or any other protective gear beyond whatever clothes you were wearing. Sleeping in a medieval forest was like trying to get comfortable in a refrigerated swamp that was also infested with tiny vampires. The ground was perpetually wet, rocky, and covered with decomposing organic matter. Insects swarmed constantly in forest environments, and many species were most active during nighttime hours when you desperately needed rest. Lice, fleas, ticks, and mosquitoes bit exposed skin relentlessly, making peaceful sleep absolutely impossible. Forest insects treated sleeping humans like an all-night buffet where the main course was your blood and the entertainment was keeping you awake. Even small bites became seriously irritated when you couldn't wash or treat them properly, leading to infections and constant discomfort. Wild animals approached quietly during the night to investigate human scents and sounds. Some creatures simply sniffed around sleeping people out of curiosity, while others pawed at or even tasted unconscious humans to determine if they were alive or dead. Sleeping in the forest was like being an exhibit in a zoo where all the visitors were predators who weren't sure if you were part of the display or tonight's dinner. Every animal encounter risked awakening to find teeth or claws much closer than you wanted them to be. Every small sound in the darkness, snapping branches, rustling leaves, distant howls, triggered fight-or-flight responses that jolted you awake just as you were finally drifting off. The forest was never truly quiet, and your brain interpreted every noise as a potential threat, requiring immediate attention. Some desperate people actually tied themselves to tree trunks with rope or strips of cloth to prevent rolling into danger while unconscious. Medieval forest camping was so dangerous that people literally had to restrain themselves to avoid accidentally committing suicide while sleeping. Sleep deprivation quickly impaired your judgment, reflexes, and decision-making abilities when you needed them most for survival. Exhausted people made poor choices about everything from food selection to route planning, creating cascading failures that often proved fatal. The combination of cold, moisture, insects, predators, and constant fear made quality rest virtually impossible. You might achieve brief periods of unconsciousness, but never the deep restorative sleep necessary for maintaining physical and mental health during extended survival situations. Medieval forests were death traps designed by nature itself. Every shadow held danger, every step risked disaster, and survival required skills most people simply didn't possess.